Hello. Right before I begin, I guess I just thought this would be a fun idea to do. So, hopefully you enjoy the audiobook, and yeah, I plan to do more Bordiga and probably more Pannekoek in the future. So, yeah. Party in Class by Amadeo Bordiga. The theses on the role of the Communist Party in the Proletarian Revolution approved by the Second Congress of the Communist International are genuinely and deeply rooted in the Marxist doctrine. These theses take the definition of the relations between party and class as a starting point and establish that the class party can include in its ranks only a part of the class itself, never the whole, not even perhaps a majority of it. This obvious truth would not have been better emphasized if it had been pointed out that one cannot speak of the class unless a minority of that class, tending to organize itself into a political party, has come into existence. What, in fact, is a social class according to our critical method? Can we possibly recognize it by means of purely objective external acknowledgement of the common economic and social conditions of a great number of individuals and of their analogous positions in the relationship of the productive process? That would not be enough. Our method does not amount to a mere description of the social structure as it exists at a given moment. Nor does it merely draw an abstract line dividing all individuals composing society into two groups, as it is done in scholastic definitions of the naturalists. The Marxist critique sees human society in its movement, in its development in time. It utilizes a fundamentally historical and dialectical criterion. That is to say, it studies the connection of the events in the reciprocal interaction, instead of taking a snapshot of society at a given moment, like the old metaphysical method, and then studying it in order to distinguish the different categories into which individuals composing it must be classified. The dialectical method sees history as a film unrolling its successive scenes. The class must be looked for and distinguished in the striking features of this movement. In using the first method, we would be the target for 1,000 objections from pure statisticians and demographers, short-sighted people if there ever were, who would re-examine our divisions and remark that there are not 2 classes, nor even 3 or 4, but that there can be 10, 100, or even 1,000 classes, separated by successive gradations and indefinable transition zones. With the second method, though, we make quite a different criteria in order to distinguish the proletariat of historical tragedy, the class, and in order to define its characteristics, its action, and its objectives, which become concretized into obviously uniform features among a multitude of changing facts. Meanwhile, the poor photographer of statistics only records these as cold series of lifeless data. Therefore, in order to state that a class exists and acts at a given moment in history, it is not enough to know, for instance, how many merchants there were in Paris under Louis XIV, or the number of English landlords in the 18th century, or the number of workers in Belgian manufacturing industry at the beginning of the 19th century. Instead, we'll have to submit an entire historical period to our logical investigations. We will have to make out for a social, and therefore political, movement, which searches for its way through the ups and downs, the errors and successes, all while obviously adhering to the interests of the strata of people who've been placed in a particular situation by the mode of production and by its developments. It is this method of analysis that Friedrich Engels used in his first classical essays, where he drew an explanation of a series of political movements from the history of the English working class, and thus demonstrated the existence of a class struggle. This dialectical concept of class allows us to overcome the statistician's pale objections. He does not have the right any longer to view the opposed classes as being clearly divided on the scene of history, as are the different chorale groups on the theater scene. He cannot refute our conclusions by arguing that in the context zone there are undefinable strata through which an osmosis of individuals takes place, because this fact does not alter the historical physiognomy of the classes facing one another. Therefore, the concept of class does not suggest to us a static image, but instead a dynamic one. When we detect a social tendency or a movement oriented towards a given end, then we can recognize the existence of a class in the true sense of the word. But then a class party exists in a material, if not yet a formal way. A party lives on in the existence of a doctrine and a method of action. A party is a school of political thought, and consequently an organization of struggle. The first characteristic is a fact of consciousness, the second is a fact of will, or more precisely, of a striving towards a final end. Without those two characteristics, we do not yet have the definition of a class. As we have already said, He who coldly records facts may find affinities in the living conditions of more or less large strata, but no mark is engraved in history's development. It is only within the class party that we find these two characteristics condensed and concretized. The class forms itself as certain conditions and relationships brought about by the consolidation of new systems of production are developed. For instance, the establishment of big factories hiring and training into a large labor force. In the same way, the interests of such a collectivity gradually begin to materialize into a more precise consciousness, which begins to take shape in the small groups of this collectivity. When the mass is thrust into action, only these first groups can foresee a final end, and this is why they support and lead the rest. When referring to a modern proletarian class, we must conceive of a process not in relationship to a trade category, but to a class as a whole. It can then be realized how a more precise consciousness of the identity of interests gradually made its appearance. This consciousness, however, results from such a complexity of experiences and ideas that it can be found only in limited groups composed of elements selected from every category. Indeed, only an advanced minority can have a clear vision of a collective action which is directed towards general ends that concern the whole class and which has at its core the project of changing the whole social regime. Those groups, those minorities, are nothing other than the party. When its formation, which of course never proceeds without arrests, crises, and internal conflicts, has reached a certain stage, then we may say that we have a class in action. Although the party includes only a part of the class, it can give the class its unity of action and movement, for it amalgamates those elements beyond the limits of categories and localities, which are sensitive to the class and represent it. This casts a light on the meaning of the basic fact: the party is only a part of the class. He who considers a static and abstract image of society, and sees the class as a zone within a small nucleus, the party, within it, might easily be led into the following conclusion. Since the whole section of class remaining outside the party is almost always a majority, it must have a greater weight and greater right. However, if it is only remembered that the individuals in that great remaining mass have neither class consciousness nor class will yet, and live for their own selfish ends, or for their trade, their village, their nation, then it will be realized that in order to secure the action of the class as a whole in the historical movement, it is necessary to have an organ which inspires, unites, and heads it. In short, which officers it. It will then be realized that the party is actually the nucleus, without which there would be no reason to consider the whole remaining mass as a mobilization of forces. The class presupposes the party, because to exist and act in history, it must possess a critical doctrine of history, and an aim to attain in it. In the only revolutionary conception, the direction of class action is delegated to the party. Doctrinal analysis, together with a number of historical experiences, allows us to easily reduce to petty bourgeois and anti-revolutionary ideologies any tendency to deny the necessity and predominance of the party's function. If this denial is based on a democratic point of view, it must be subjected to the same criticism that Marxism uses to disprove the favorite theorems of bourgeois liberalism. It is sufficient to recall that, if the consciousness of human beings is the result, not the cause of characteristics of the surroundings in which they are compelled to live and act, then never as a rule will the exploited, the starved, the underfed be able to convince themselves of the necessity of overthrowing the well-fed, satiated exploiter laden with every resource and capacity. This can only be the exception. Bourgeois electoral democracy seeks the consultation of the masses, for it knows that the response of the majority will always be favorable to the privileged class, and will readily delegate to that class the right to govern and to perpetuate exploitation. It is not the addition or subtraction of the small minority of bourgeois voters that will alter the relationship. The bourgeoisie governs with the majority, not only of all the citizens, but also of the workers taken alone. Therefore, if the party called on the whole proletarian mass to judge the actions and initiatives of which the party alone has the responsibility, it would tie itself to a verdict that will almost certainly be favorable to the bourgeoisie. That verdict will always be less enlightened, less advanced, less revolutionary, and above all, less dictated by a consciousness of the really collective interest of the workers and of the final result of the revolutionary struggle, than the advice coming from the ranks of the organized party alone. The concept of the proletariat's right to command its own class action is only an abstraction devoid of any Marxist sense. It conceals a desire to lead the Revolutionary Party to enlarge itself by including the less mature strata. Since this progressively occurs, the resulting decisions get nearer and nearer the bourgeois in conservative conceptions. If we looked for evidence not only through theoretical inquiry, but also through in the experiences history has given us, our harvest would be abundant. Let us remember that the typical bourgeois cliché to oppose the good common sense of the masses to the evil of a minority of agitators, and to pretend to be the most favorably disposed towards the exploited's interests. The right-wing currents of the workers' movement, the social democratic school, whose reactionary tenets have been clearly shown by history, constantly oppose the masses to the party, and pretend to be able to find the will of the class by consulting on a scale wider than beyond the limited bounds of the party. When they cannot extend the party beyond all limits of doctrine and discipline and action, they try to establish that its main organs must not be those appointed by a limited number of militant members, but must be those who have been appointed for parliamentary duties by a larger body. Actually, parliamentary groups belong to the extreme right wing of the parties from which they come. The degeneration of the social democratic parties of the Second International, and the fact that they apparently became less revolutionary than the unorganized masses, are due to the fact that they gradually lost their specific party character precisely through workerist and laborist practices. That is, they no longer acted as the vanguard preceding the class, but as its mechanical expression in an electoral and corporative system, where equal importance and influence is given to the strata that are least conscious and the most dependent on egotistical claims of the proletarian class itself. As a reaction to this epidemic, even before the war, there developed a tendency, particularly in Italy, advocating internal party discipline, rejecting new recruits who had not yet welded to our revolutionary doctrine, opposing the autonomy of the parliamentary groups and local organs, and recommending that the party should be purged of its false elements. This method has proved to be the real antidote for reformism, and forms the basis of the doctrine and practice of the Third International, which puts a primary importance on the role of the party. That is, a centralized, disciplined party with a clear orientation of the problems of principles and tactics. The same Third International judged the collapse of the social democratic parties of the Second International was by no means the collapse of the proletarian parties in general, but, if we may say so, the failure of organisms that had forgotten they were parties because they had stopped being parties. There is also a different category of objection to the communist concept of the party's role. Those objections are linked to another form of critical and tactical reaction to the reformist degeneracy. They belong to the syndicalist school, which sees the class in the economic trade unions and pretends that these are the organs capable of leading the class in revolution. Following the classical period of the French, Italian, and American syndicalism, these apparently left-wing objections found new formulations and tendencies which are on the margins of the Third International. These too can be easily reduced to semi-bourgeois ideologies by critique of their principles, as well as acknowledging the historical result they led to. These tendencies would like to recognize the class within an organization of its own, certainly a characteristic and a more important one. That is, the craft or trade unions, which arise before the political party, to gather much larger masses, and therefore better correspond to the whole of the working class. From an abstract point of view, however, the choice of such a criterion reveals an unconscious respect for that self-same democratic lie which the bourgeoisie relies on to secure its power by the means of inviting the majority of the people to choose their government. In other theoretical viewpoints, such a method meets with bourgeois conceptions when it entrusts the trade unions with the organization of the new society, and demands the autonomy and decentralization of productive functions, just as reactionary economists do. But our present purpose is not to draw out a complete critical analysis of the syndicalist doctrines. It is sufficient to remark, considering the result of historical experience, that the extreme right-wing members of the proletarian movement have always advocated the same point of view. That is, the representation of the working class by trade unions. Indeed, they know that by doing so, they soften and diminish the movement's character, for the simple reason that we have already mentioned. Today, the bourgeoisie shows a sympathy and an inclination, which are by no means illogical, towards the unionization of the working class. Indeed, the more intelligent sections of the bourgeoisie would readily accept a reform of the state and representative apparatus in order to give a larger place to the apolitical unions, and even to their claims to exercise control over the system of production. The bourgeoisie feels that, as long as the proletariat's action can be limited to the immediate economic demands that are raised trade by trade, it helps to safeguard the status quo and to avoid the reformation of the perilous political consciousness that is the only consciousness which is revolutionary, for it aims at the enemy's vulnerable point, the possession of power. Past and present syndicalists, however, have always been conscious of the fact that most trade unions are controlled by right-wing elements, and that the dictatorship of the petty bourgeois leaders over the masses is based on a union bureaucracy, even more than the electoral mechanism of the social democratic pseudo-parties. Therefore, the syndicalists, along with the very numerous elements who were merely acting in reaction to the reformist practice, devoted themselves to the study of the new forms of union organization and created new unions independent from the traditional ones. Such an expedient was theoretically wrong, for it did not go beyond the fundamental criterion of the economic organization. That is, the automatic admission of all those who are placed in given conditions by the part they play in production, without demanding specific political convictions or special pledges of action, which may require even the sacrifice of their lives. Moreover, in looking for the producer, it could not go beyond the limits of the trade, whereas the class party, by considering the proletarian in the vast range of his conditions and activities, is alone able to awaken the revolutionary spirit of the class. Thereby, that remedy, which was wrong theoretically and proved inefficient in actuality. In spite of everything, such recipes are constantly being sought for even today. A totally wrong interpretation of Marxist determinism and a limited conception of the party played by facts of consciousness and will in formation under the original influence of economic factors, of the revolutionary forces, lead a great number of people to look for a mechanical system of organization that would almost automatically organize the masses according to such individuals' part in production. According to these illusions, such a device by itself would be enough to make the mass ready to move towards revolution with the maximum revolutionary efficiency. Thus, the illusory solution reappears, which consists of thinking what the everyday satisfaction of economic needs can be reconciled with the final result of an overthrow of the social system by relying on an organizational form to solve an old antithesis between limited and gradual conquests and the maximum revolutionary program. But, as was rightly said in the resolutions of the majority of the German Communist Party, at a time when these questions, which later provoked the secession of the KAPD, were particularly acute in Germany, revolution is not a question of the form of organization. Revolution requires an organization of active and positive forces united by a doctrine and a final aim. Immediate strata and innumerable individuals will remain outside this organization, even though they materially belong to the class in whose interest the revolution will triumph. But the class lives, struggles, progresses, and wins, thanks to the action of the forces it has engendered from its womb in the pains of history. The class originates from an immediate homogeneity of economic conditions, which appear to us as the primary motive force of the tendency to destroy and go beyond the present mode of production. But, in order to assume this great task, the class must have its own thought, its own critical method, its own will bent on the precise ends defined by research and criticism, and its own organization of struggle channeling and utilizing with the utmost efficiency its collective efforts and sacrifices. All this constitutes the party. Alright, now we have Anton Pannekoek's Party in Class, written in 1936. The old labor movement is organized in parties. The belief in parties is the main reason for the impotence of the working class. Therefore, we avoid forming a new party, not because we are too few, but because a party is an organization that aims to lead and control the working class. In opposition to this, we maintain that the working class can rise to victory only when it independently attacks its problems and decides its own fate. The workers should not blindly accept the slogans of others, nor of our own groups, but must think, act, and decide for themselves. This conception is in sharp contradiction to the tradition of the party, as the most important means of educating the proletariat. Therefore, many, though repudiating the socialist and communist parties, resist and oppose us. This is partly due to their traditional concepts. After viewing the class struggle as a struggle of parties, it becomes difficult to consider it as a struggle of the working class, as a class struggle. But partly, this concept is based on the idea that the party nevertheless plays an essential and important role in the struggle of the proletariat. Let us investigate this latter idea more closely. Essentially, The party is a grouping according to views, conceptions. The classes are a grouping according to economic interests. Class membership is determined by one's part in the process of production. Party membership is the joining of persons who agree in their conceptions of the social problems. Formerly, it was thought that this contradiction would disappear in the class party, the workers' party. During the rise of social democracy, it seemed that it gradually embraces the whole working class, partly as members, partly as supporters, because Marxian theory declared that similar interests beget similar viewpoints and aims. The contradiction between party and class was expected gradually to disappear. History proved otherwise. Social democracy remained a minority, other working class groups organized against it, sections split away from it, and its own character changed. Its own program was revised or reinterpreted. The evolution of society does not proceed along a smooth, even line, but in conflicts and contradictions. With the intensification of the workers' struggle, the might of the enemy also increases and besets the worker with renewed doubts and fears to which road is best. And every doubt brings on splits, contradictions, and factional battles within the labor movement. It is futile to bewail these conflicts and splits as harmful in dividing and weakening the working class. The working class is not weak because it is split up. It is split up because it is weak. Because the enemy is powerful and the old methods of warfare prove unavailing. The working class must seek new methods. Its class will not become clear as the result of enlightenment from above, but it must discover its tasks through hard work, through thought, and conflict of opinion. It must find its own way, therefore, the internal struggle. It must relinquish old ideas and illusions and adopt new ones. And because this is difficult, therefore, the magnitude and severity of the splits. Nor can we delude ourselves into believing that this period of party and ideological strife is only temporary and will make way to renewed harmony. True, in the course of the class struggle, there are occasions when all forces unite and the great unachievable objective and the revolution is carried on with the might of the united working class. But after that, as after every victory, come differences on the question, what next? And even if the working class is victorious, it is always confronted by the most difficult task of subduing the enemy further, of reorganizing production, of creating new order. It is impossible that all workers, all strata and groups, with their often diverse interests, should, at this stage, agree on all matters and be ready for united and decisive further action. They will find the true course only after the sharpest controversies and conflicts, and only thus achieve clarity. If, in this situation, persons with the same fundamental conceptions reunite for the discussion of practical steps and seek clarification through discussions and propagandize their conclusions, such groups might be called parties, but they would be parties in an entirely different sense from those of today. Action, the actual class struggle, is the task of the working masses themselves, in their entirety, in their real groupings as factory mill hands, or other productive groups. Because history and the economy have placed them in the position where they must and can fight the working class struggle, it would be insane if the supporters of one party were to go on strike while those of another continue to work. In both tendencies, we thus defend their positions on strike or no strike in the factory meetings, and thus affording an opportunity to arrive at a well-founded decision. The struggle is so great, the enemy is so powerful, that only the masses as a whole can achieve a victory. The result of the material and moral power of action, the unity and enthusiasm, but also the result of the mental force of thought, of clarity. In this lies the great importance of such parties or groups based on opinions, that they bring clarity to in their conflicts, discussion and propaganda. They are but the organs of self-enlightenment of the working class by means of which the workers find their way to freedom. Of course, such parties are not static or unchangeable. Every new situation, every new problem will find minds diverging and uniting in new groups with new programs. They have a fluctuating character and constantly readjust themselves to new situations. Compared to such groups, the present Workers' Party have an entirely different character, for they have different objectives. They want to seize power for themselves. They aim not at being an aid to the working class in its struggle for emancipation, but to rule it in themselves and proclaim that this constitutes the emancipation of the proletariat. The social democracy, which arose in an era of parliamentarianism, conceived of this rule as a parliamentary government. The Communist Party carries the idea of party rule through to its fullest extreme in the party dictatorship. Such parties, in distinction to the groups described above, must be rigid structures with clear lines of demarcation. through membership cards, statutes, party discipline, and admission and expulsion procedures. For they are instruments of power, and they fight for power, bridle their members by force, and constantly seek to extend the scope of their power. It is not their task to develop the initiative of the workers, rather they aim at training loyal and unquestioning members of their faith. While the working class in its struggle for power and victory needs unlimited intellectual freedom, the party must suppress all opinions except its own. In democratic parties, the suppression is veiled. In the dictatorship parties, it is an open, brutal suppression. Many workers already realize that the rule of socialist or communist parties will only be the concealed form of rule of the bourgeois class in which the exploitation and suppression of the working class remains. Instead of these parties, they urge the formation of a revolutionary party, and they will aim at the rule of the workers and the realization of communism. Not a party in the sense described above, but a party like those of today, that fight for power as a vanguard of the class, as the organization of conscious revolutionary minorities, that seize power in order to use it for the emancipation of the class. We claim that there is an internal contradiction in the term revolutionary party. Such a party cannot be revolutionary. It is no more revolutionary than the creators of the Third Reich. When we speak of revolution, we speak of the proletarian revolution, the seizure of power by the working class itself. The Revolutionary Party is based on the idea that the working class needs a new group of leaders who vanquish the bourgeoisie for the workers and construct a new government. Note the working class is not yet considered fit to reorganize and regulate production. But is not this as it should be? As the working class does not seem to be capable of revolution, is it not necessary that the revolutionary vanguard, the party, make a revolution for it? And is this not true as long as the masses willingly endure capitalism? Against this, we raise the question, what forces can such a party raise for the revolution? How is it able to defeat the capitalist class? Only if the masses stand behind it. Only if the masses rise through mass attacks, mass struggle, and mass strikes, overthrow the old regime. Without the action of the masses, there can be no revolution. Two things can follow. The masses remain in action. They do not go home and leave the government to the new party. They organize their power in factory and workshop and prepare for a further conflict in order to defeat capital. Through the workers' councils, they establish a form union to take over the complete direction of all society. In other words, they prove that they are not as incapable of revolution as it seemed. Of necessity, then, conflict will arise with the party which itself wants to take control and which only sees disorder and anarchy in the self-action of the working class. Possibly the workers will develop their movement and sweep out the party, or the party, with the help of the bourgeois elements, defeats the workers. In either case, the party is an obstacle to the revolution because it wants to be more than a means of propaganda and enlightenment, because it feels itself called upon to lead and rule as a party. On the other hand, the masses may follow the party faith and leave it to the full direction of affairs. They follow the slogans from above, have confidence in the new government, as in Germany and Russia, that is, to realize communism, and go back home to work. Immediately, the bourgeoisie exerts its whole class power on the roots of which are unbroken, its financial forces, its great intellectual resources, and its economic power in factories and great enterprises. Against this, the government party is too weak. Only through moderation, concessions, and yielding can it maintain that it is insanity for the workers to try to force impossible demands. Thus, the party deprived of class power becomes an instrument for maintaining bourgeois power. We said before that the term revolutionary party was contradictory from the proletarian's point of view. We can say that otherwise. In the term revolutionary party, revolutionary always means a bourgeois revolution. Always. When the masses overthrow government and then allow a new party to take power, we have a bourgeois revolution, the substitution of a ruling caste by a new ruling caste. It was so in Paris in 1830 when the finance bourgeoisie supplanted the landed proprietors, in 1848 when the industrial bourgeoisie took over their reins. In the Russian Revolution, the party bureaucracy came to power as the ruling caste. But in Western Europe and America, the bourgeoisie is much more powerfully entrenched in the plants and banks, so that the party bureaucracy cannot push them aside so easily. The bourgeoisie in these countries must be vanquished only by repeated and united action of the masses in which they seize the mills and factories and build up their council organizations. Those who speak of revolutionary parties draw incomplete, limited conclusions from history. When the socialist and communist parties become organs of bourgeois rule for the perpetuation of exploitation, these well-meaning people merely concluded that they would do better.
They cannot realize that the failure of the parties is due to the fundamental conflict between the self-emancipation of the working class through its own power and the pacifying of the revolution through a new sympathetic ruling clique. They think that they are the revolutionary vanguard because they see the masses indifferent and inactive. But the masses are inactive only because they cannot yet comprehend the course of the struggle and the unity of class interests, although they instinctively sense the great power of the enemy and the immenseness of their tasks. Once conditions force them into action, they will attack the task of self-organization and the conquest of the economic power of capital.